We as consumers want to make good choices, so we want to consume products that are going to promote sustainability, but actually it's very difficult to know for sure what an organisation is really doing. So greenwashing is a really interesting concept because it's about two things. It's about what a firm says it's going to do in terms of being green or sustainable, and what a firm really does in terms of the actions it takes to be more sustainable. And this ability to compare the two allows us to understand when there's a gap, and when there's a gap, when a firm doesn't walk their talk, we can identify that as greenwashing. Now, greenwashing is a really multi-layered kind of concept in that it has impacts for organisations, how they fear and manage their own reputations, how they fear greenwashing, and how as we as individuals then interact with organisations, that we're doing so with ever greater scrutiny, in fact, about their green credentials. So this is a really important topic at the moment. We've learned a lot through the pandemic. I think we have been able to really stop and recognise the impacts of interconnections that we will have with one another across society, across the world. And so we've had this sort of moment at the moment where we are certainly seeing a lot more people buying less for a period of time and thinking more about how they consume. You know, who knows how it's going to unfold, but we've certainly seen some shifts. So it will be really interesting to understand what goes on in the future in terms of a kind of tipping point of stakeholders wanting to drive greenwashing out, I suppose, and demand that firms more closely align their talk and their walk. We as stakeholders, so employees of organisations, consumers of products, we want to have faith, we want to trust our organisations that they're doing the right thing. We want this climate emergency to be addressed, right? So we want to know that our efforts in terms of the projects we're involved in terms of the products that we buy, are going in the right direction to be more sustainable in reality, and not just so that the organisation can appear to look good, but without making much change for sustainability. What benefits a firm from greenwashing? And there are some very many benefits out there. If we look at the logistics of implementing change to be greener, we're often talking about a project that is costly, that's going to take time, and that will require change to the operations of a firm. And there's lots of uncertainty here on what is required. And so sometimes firms feel compelled to send out the right messages. So we want to have a good opinion of this firm, and so it may want to communicate with us and give us talk about how important sustainability is to the firm. In practice, sustainability might be important, it's also difficult. So to avoid the cost and the complication of actually putting these changes into place, they may avoid or delay that and create this gap. So the concept of greenwashing is something that firms are also aware of. And they try very hard not to be greenwashers. And that's a bit of a concern in some ways. So while we do want our firms to walk the talk, we don't want them to be self-conscious. We don't want them to not take action for fear of how they're judged. They might worry that they would be regarded as a greenwasher if they started to do more sustainability stuff. Because the very nature of being sustainable, of doing more green activities, is a process of learning. And so firms inevitably are going to be imperfect in the way that they go about this. So we have a kind of strange situation where I think firms are doing more to be sustainable, but perhaps not as much as we need them to be doing. But at the same time, they're probably making more than they should do out of the activities that they undertake, because they're very aware of the scrutiny that they're under. And so on the one hand, we feel quite empowered if we're able to identify the practice of greenwashing and withhold our custom or stop supporting that organisation in some way. But at the same time, the concept can cause a kind of paralysis to the extent that we then have doubts about the way in which we move forward with these kinds of firms. And so there's these sort of unintended consequences that while we feel empowered by this idea that we can have some kind of visibility about the failure of the firm, it actually means that we're not necessarily trusting enough of the new initiatives as much as we could. We're not engaging as proactively as we might if we're in a kind of skeptical mindset. Greenwashing is a bit about the transparency, that we're beginning to be able to see what an organisation says it does in terms of being green and what it really does in terms of being green. So this notion of transparency is really important. But I think transparency for firms, therefore, needs to be about being proactive in declaring the mistakes that it's made, into explaining when things go wrong. When you read those reports about how great the firm is and all the great things they're doing about sustainability, it's not a balanced view. We're not hearing about the issues they've had, the mistakes they've made, where things have gone wrong, where people have been harmed, where there's been a depletion of resources or other kinds of environmental impacts. We're not hearing a kind of balanced picture, and I think until we can reward firms for being honest in terms of when things go wrong, we're going to have this doubt and skepticism about their behaviour. We want to hear about all the bad stuff firms are doing, and then we will believe them that they really are good guys. We need to find ways for industries as a whole together to accept the blame, rather than focus down on a firm that gets caught out in any particular situation, because if there are issues in a supply chain of one firm, there are also going to be issues elsewhere. And so I think we need to move away from a culture that intensifies judgment on one firm to what is going on at the industry level, and have efforts where firms together take responsibility for impacts in their industry. And I think without that, firms are going to be acting very defensively and self-consciously about their behaviours. And so to get real change, I think firms are going to need to get together and to shoulder that burden of responsibility about their practices in a more kind of unified way. My work looks at this in lots of different ways. So some examples that I have, I've been doing some studies into sustainability standards. We can look at things like human rights policies as well, and in the same way we can look at that as an expression of organisational talk, and look at then, and my research looks at what organisations are really doing in practice and why those gaps come about. And it can be quite interesting in that it's not always about firms manipulating or being deceitful in some ways, often because they're in a process of learning. So being green isn't easy, and so we're naturally in this situation where aspirational firms have to make commitments that they're not sure about how they can complete. So I explore all those kind of interactions.